This week on C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast, law professor and author Joyce Lee Malcolm examines the remarkable military career of Benedict Arnold, from his Revolutionary War victories to the infamous turn that branded him America's most notorious traitor. Speaking at the University of Mary Washington, Professor Malcolm challenges whether that reputation tells the whole story. And a note to our listeners, with the academic year now wrapped, Lectures in History will pause new episodes until September. Over the summer, we'll revisit some of our most compelling past lectures and other history-focused programs. More in a moment.
This summer, honor your democracy hero and ignite C-SPAN's America 250 coverage, our 18-month ad-free celebration of our nation's story. Give $25 or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate to add the person who first showed you democracy in action to our Democracy Hero wall. We'll thank you with a C-SPAN decal. Your gift keeps these stories alive nationwide. Donate today at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
What a nice crowd tonight. Better weather, right? Better weather. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to welcome to tonight's lecture on one of this country's most noted lives, though many would say noted for the wrong reasons. For generations, the name Benedict Arnold has almost universally elicited a one-word description from most Americans: traitor. But perhaps we were wrong, or at least partly wrong. So tonight we will hear, to use the old Paul Harvey phrase, the rest of the story. But first, it's a special pleasure to recognize the sponsor of tonight's program, Mary Lou Chapel, because she and her husband John have been the foremost supporters of Great Lives since the very beginning. It is, in fact, no exaggeration to say that the program would not exist as we know it today without the extreme generosity of the Chapel family. And so we are delighted that Mary Lou and John have joined us tonight from Philadelphia, as it gives us the opportunity to express our deep appreciation for all that they have done for our program, not just for tonight in particular, but for every night. John and Mary Lou, would you stand, please? Tonight's speaker, Dr. Joyce Lee Malcolm, earned her BA degree from Barnard College, followed by an MA and PhD in comparative history from Brandeis University. She has taught at Princeton University, Bentley College, Austin University, Northeastern University, and Cambridge University. She is currently the Patrick Henry Professor of Constitutional Law and the Second Amendment at the Scalia School of Law at George Mason University. As an acknowledged authority in constitutional history, particularly in the areas of gun control, Second Amendment, and individual rights, she has published widely, including essays in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, USA Today, the Boston Globe, and other newspapers. She has written 8 books, the most recent of which, and the basis of tonight's lecture, is The Tragedy of Benedict Arnold. Evaluating that book, one reviewer wrote that, quote, "In clear, engaging language, Malcolm reconstructs the surroundings, relationships, and political atmosphere of the Revolution. It is a vivid addition to Revolutionary War literature." Another called it a work of genuine excellence, as persuasive in its argument as it is unsettling in its implications. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome to the Great Lives podium Dr. Joyce Malcolm.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank you, Professor Crawley and the sponsors for inviting me. This is a real treat for me to be able to talk about this subject. Get my act together here. I was going to say that the State of the Union in Benedict Arnold's time was not good. He's widely known, as Professor Crowley said, for treason, but before that, he was one of the great heroes of the Revolution. And I'd like to get into some of the details and the context in which he was acting in that revolution. He's been considered and blamed for being greedy and self-serving and reckless, but it didn't really seem to me to make sense about someone who had actually risked his life on numerous battlefields, who, when the Congress didn't pay his men, paid them from his own resources, and really took that opportunity to serve his country before he decided to change sides. I just started here. There's a picture of the man in his younger days. He said during a court-martial, when he, by the way, he was court-martialed not for any military problem, but for some of the feeling that he had misused his position for financial gain after he was wounded and was serving in Philadelphia as the commander there. He said, "I have suffered in seeing the fair fabric of reputation, which I have been with so much danger and toil raising since the present war, undermined by those whose posterity, as well as themselves, will feel the blessed effects of my efforts." And below that is a description by one of the men who fought beside him and who he led at the Battle of Bemis Heights, which is the beginning of the Battle of Saratoga. He said he was dark-skinned with black hair and middling height. There wasn't any waist timber in him. He was our fighting general, and a bloody fellow he was. He didn't care for nothing. He'd ride right in. It was, "Come on, boys." 'Twasn't, "Go, boys." He was as brave a man as ever lived. Oops, wait, I want to get to that later. At any rate, these damning judgments about him didn't seem to make much sense, and I wanted to have a better understanding of what he did beforehand and why he decided to change sides. J.W. Fortescue, who was this sort of classic historian of the British Army, said this about Arnold. He said, "In natural military genius, neither Washington nor Greene are, to my mind, comparable with Benedict Arnold. He possessed all the gifts of a great commander. To boundless energy and enterprise, he united quick insight into a situation, sound strategic instinct, audacity of movement, wealth of resource, a swift and unerring eye in action, great personal daring, and true magic of leadership. It was he and no other who beat Burgoyne at Saratoga, and with Daniel Morgan from Virginia to command his militia, Benedict Arnold was the most formidable opponent that could be matched against the British in America." Now, and particularly, I guess, advertised in the TV series Turn, his lovely young wife, Peggy Shippen, has become equally notorious and is sometimes regarded as a sort of the Eve who tempted her husband into committing treason. I'll say a bit about Peggy when I get to that point in his story, but there are obviously lots of the events in Arnold's life I'm not going to be able to talk about unless you want to stay here all night. So I'm just going to highlight some of the particular points and key moments in his career. I'd like to go in some detail into the Battle of Lake Champlain, and this is one that I think people know a bit less about than they do about Saratoga and other battles. It started in October of 1776. The British had amassed some 13,000 British, Irish, and German troops in Canada ready for an assault going down Lake Champlain in an effort to take Albany. There was a lot of emphasis on trying to single out New York State and separate it from New England in order to give them an advantage. They had been bringing over ships, and the Americans had no ships on Lake Champlain with which to combat this British fleet. The Lake Champlain itself is a beautiful lake. It's 4 miles wide at its widest point and about 400 feet deep in some spots, but also very shallow in the inlets. The New York Committee of Safety was desperate about trying to build some kind of a fleet in order to stop this British fleet from coming down Lake Champlain and taking Albany. And they asked Arnold to build that fleet. I'm from upstate New York. It is not the ideal place to be building a fleet of ships, even in good weather. But Arnold had been brought up by a father who was a merchant seaman, and in his youth he had spent summers on the sailing ships with his father going across to Europe and up and down the coast of North America. His father died after a rather sad career where he became depressed and alcoholic and bankrupt. And Arnold started his own business and became a merchant seaman as well. So he was an ideal person to ask to build ships. He tried to recruit artisans to build these ships. It was hard to get seamen because most of the people who were experienced seamen were with Washington trying to protect Manhattan from the British. He personally selected 20,000 boards of timber to build these ships. And of course, the timber has to be aged because otherwise it's just going to crack and be useless for the ships. This is the main ship that was going to be his flagship. It's called the Royal Savage, and he was responsible for actually snatching it from the British after he took Ticonderoga the year before. So they got this ship from Canada. He also built a couple of schooners, galleys that were 80 feet by 20 feet with 2 masts and lateen sails, and then a series of ships that were called gondolas. These are not your Venetian gondolas. For some reason, they are traditional gondolas, and they actually carry a crew of about 45. They have 6 cannon and then this 1 mast. They're very shallow, so these ships could be more maneuverable than the big ships that the British were bringing down, and were very good for the waters there. So in the course of 2 months, he was able to build this fleet of some 15 ships. The British built their fleet, actually, in Canada in 3 months. And one of the things they did that I thought was quite amazing was that they brought over from Britain kind of prefab sections of ship, which they then assembled when they got to Canada and prepared to come down Lake Champlain. This was the largest of the British ships, Thunderer. The British had a much bigger fleet, as you can imagine. Flexible and Thunderer were their 2 largest ships, and they each carried 6 24-pound guns. They had 20 gunships and 5 large vessels. And Thunderer, 423 pounds, was the largest ship ever seen on Lake Champlain. All of Arnold's ships together had a combined cannon weight, which is the way they sort of evaluated navies, a combined cannon weight of 703 pounds. The British ships, by contrast, had a combined cannon weight of 1,300 pounds, so they had almost twice the firepower of Arnold's fleet. Arnold had been surveying Lake Champlain to find a proper place to send his fleet to await the British coming down from Canada. He decided that he would take his fleet, and if you have a smaller force, you don't want to be out in the open, you want somewhere where you're protected, to be in the shadow of an island called Valcour Island, which you can see on the map. Looks much bigger on that map than it actually is. But Arnold's ships are the little clear ones in the shadow of that island. And they hid there from August until September 23rd, when he took his ships with 500 men to Valcour Island. They were painted red, so they would blend with the leaves of that autumn, and camouflaged with boughs of spruce trees, which were sharpened on points and put around the edges of the ships to keep enemy sailors from boarding. They stayed behind that island waiting for the British fleet to appear. And on October 11th, the British were spotted at 8 in the morning. The British did not even have Valcour Island on their map. They just came sailing down, and just as Arnold had hoped, they went beyond Valcour Island. You see that dots going down, and didn't even see Arnold's fleet until they were about 5 miles south of Valcour Island, at which point, of course, they turned and had to go upstream in order to fight the Americans. To really get them into action, Arnold, on the Royal Savage and another of his ships, sort of went toward the British ships to try to lure them into the shallows around Valcour Island. But he got caught in the crossfire, and his ship got stuck on a reef, and just devastated, so he had to switch to another ship called the Congress. By noon, the fighting was general. The noise of the cannon could be heard 30 miles to the south. The battle raged for 6 hours, and it's really to his credit that this little fleet was able to keep this much bigger British fleet, filled with really experienced sailors and officers, fighting for 6 hours. But by the end of it, about 80 of his men had been killed or wounded. They used up 3/4 of their ammunition, and his ships were in really bad shape. And so they retreated further into that channel next to Valcour Island. And the British were just assumed that in the morning they would be able to finish off this little American fleet. But Arnold had a plan. Now, unfortunately, his route of escape was to the south, down to Crown Point and then Ticonderoga. And the British ships were, as you can see, toward the south end of that island. So he had to somehow figure out what to do. I'm just going to read you a little section from the book about this. This is that evening. General Waterbury and Colonel Wigglesworth rode through the black waters that night to meet Arnold aboard the Congress. They were despondent, but Arnold had prepared for this moment. He had a plan, a desperate but doable plan. The fleet would escape that evening by slipping between the British ships, blocking the Valcour Island channel, then dash south to Crown Point in safety. It was an exceedingly risky strategy. Many of their vessels were badly damaged, and some were leaking. The little fleet with its 500 sailors had lost 80 men killed or wounded, including many officers, with 20 others captured. If any of the British crews spotted them, they would be vulnerable and readily destroyed. But what other option do they have? It was a moonless night, and they set out at 7 o'clock. A heavy autumn mist rising from the lake shrouded the American ships as they began moving in single file. They muffled their oars with the men's shirts and kept the wounded below decks so that their cries and moans would not be heard and alert the enemy. Each ship was completely dark except for a small lantern in the stern and a shrouded one in the bow. A chalk mark on the rear rails lit by a slit in the rear lantern made the vessel's stern just visible to the ship immediately behind. Wigglesworth and the galley Trumbull led. One by one, the gondolas and the smaller vessels followed in silence. The Congress with Arnold aboard and the Washington were last in line. The procession passed so close to the Carleton, that's one of the British ships, they could hear its sailors chatting as they glided beside it. They were in luck. The British had moved their 3 largest men of war a mile out from the western shore of the lake, inadvertently leaving a passageway for the American ships to slip through. They got through that night. And the next morning, when the British admiral was convinced that he would be able to just finish off this American fleet, he discovered that they were gone. Now, he assumed that they would have gone north up the Valcour Island channel, but they could not have done that because it was far too shallow, but he didn't know that. So first he went north looking for them, and then when he couldn't find them, he turned around and went south. The American ships had gone about 7 miles to Schuyler's Island in order to try to repair some of the ones that were repairable. And then they headed for Crown Point, which was 28 miles to the south.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
As they were going, the British eventually caught up with them. And so 2 of the ships, the Congress that Washington was on and the ship Washington, turned to fight the British fleet, while the rest of them got away. The Washington was really badly hit, and its commander finally surrendered, leaving Arnold and the Congress alone against the British fleet. They fought until their masts were torn to pieces, the little flag flying, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag that we're so familiar with in Virginia and other states. Eventually ran out of ammunition, and with the ship torn to pieces, he broke through on some of these little gondolas and made for a creek that was on the Vermont shore. The men waded ashore with their weapons, their ships, and burnt the ships so that the British would not be able to take them. They then began a march through the woods, carrying the wounded in litters that were made of the sails from the ships. When they got to Crown Point, they realized it was unsafe and went on to Ticonderoga, another 20 miles, carrying these wounded, and finally reached it on October 15th. Carleton, who was the admiral and in charge of the British fleet, had caught up and destroyed most of the American fleet, but it was now late in October. He didn't have any particular supplies up in that part of Lake Champlain in Vermont or New York. He didn't know what to do, whether to wait through the spring and stay there right through the winter or not. And he decided that it was too risky staying there, that his ships might get frozen into the ice. And so he turned around and went back to Canada. And the result was that even though Arnold's little fleet was destroyed, they were able to hold the British up long enough that they saved New York and Albany for another year. It wasn't until the following year that you have the Battle of Saratoga. General Gates, who was the overall commander of the Army, the American Army in that area, wrote to one of the other generals, Schuyler. He said, "It has pleased Providence to preserve General Arnold. Few men ever met with so many hairbreadth escapes in so short a spate of time." And then his general orders on that day asked the men to give thanks to General Arnold and the officers, seamen, and mariners, Marines of the fleet for the gallant defense they made against the great superiority of the enemy's force. The historian of the British Army was scathing about Carleton having decided to go back up to Canada. Very different it would have been if the British had been commanded by such a man as Arnold, he said, whose amazing skill, gallantry, and resource make him undoubtedly the hero of this short campaign. So after that, Arnold went with Gates south to Washington's camp, and he was there at about the time that Washington decided to cross the Delaware and attack Trenton. By the way, Washington actually had to do that because the men were on such short enlistments that if he waited any longer, his army would have gone home. So while he had them all under his command, they crossed the Delaware and were able to conquer Trenton, and it was one great victory for that time. Congress decided that it was really important, finally, to give Washington an army with longer enlistments, but they exacted something from him for that. They deprived Washington of the power of appointing or discharging any of his general officers. And we read about all of these soldiers of fortune from France and Germany coming across, to join the Continental Army. They were given superior commands by Congress, not by Washington. And there was a lot of disgruntlement among the officers of the American Army that these people were brought in over and put in superior positions over them. But at any rate, so they took from Washington this ability to appoint and discharge his officers, and then they promoted 5 junior officers to Major General ahead of Arnold. Some of these people had never done anything, and Washington was really amazed that Congress had done that and wasn't sure why. It turned out that apparently you were only, according to Congress, allowed to have so many major generals depending on the number of men that you were in regiments from your state. But at any rate, he was very disgruntled about that and upset and ready to resign. And of course, there are a lot of people now that write, well, he was too prickly. What made him think that, if these feelings were hurt, someone was promoted over him? But it was considered then a polite way of telling you that you were no longer wanted. And I was thinking that even today, sometimes when somebody is appointed over you, there's this sense that maybe this is a nice way of saying, we're sorry. So at any rate, he was ready to resign, but Washington asked him to stay on, and he said he would stay as long as Washington felt that his services were needed. On his way, he was sent to Rhode Island, but on the way he went home, and he was from Connecticut, so he went back to Connecticut, where he had, his wife had died, but he had 3 children who were being looked after by his sister, and his business that she was looking after, not in a very good way. She sold off virtually all of the equipment and supplies that he had, but that was her way. At any rate, he was treated as a hero in New Haven and Hartford and Middletown. But while he was there, he got a message that while he was at home trying to figure out his finances, he got a message that the British were landing troops in Connecticut and were on their way to take some of the supplies that the Americans had been gathering there. A courier had arrived at his home with this news, and some 26 ships were spotted off of Norwalk, making for this Campo Beach, 25 miles south of New Haven. And their object was a supply depot at Danbury, which was only lightly defended. 2 of the generals from that Connecticut were leading 600 militia and had already marched off, hoping to protect the supplies at Danbury, and Arnold rushed from his home to join them and rallied the militia to help him. The officers and men arrived at Bethel, 4 miles from Danbury, at 2 in the morning, only to learn the depot was already in flames, along with many houses in the town. And the British, led by William Traitor, governor of New York, had accomplished their goal and they were gone. The Americans weren't sure which way they had gone and just were determined to head them off before they got back on their ships. So they divided their exhausted troops to take them on. Pursuers and pursued struggled through driving rain. Members of the Connecticut militia were proud to rally behind Arnold and joined him. The British were heading for Ridgefield, town of Ridgefield, and apparently they had some really good information because they set the homes of known patriots ablaze and scorched the Presbyterian church where the munitions were stored. So there were a lot of people living around who were happy to tell them who they should be looking for to harm. One of the men who'd taken some of the troops, Worcester, had taken 2 men along another route than Arnold, aiming to get behind the enemy, and he caught up with the British, but in the fighting, this elderly gentleman received a fatal wound. Arnold and another general began a forced march to Ridgefield with 500 militia, and they caught up with the regulars about 11 in the morning. They had 500 men, but their troops were outnumbered by about 2,000. I'm losing my, oh, here it is. Sorry, 2,000 of the British regulars. Arnold ordered his men to make a makeshift barrier. There we go, here's Ridgefield, out of wagons and other materials so that they could basically hold off the British behind that makeshift barrier. And they did hold off 3 charges. They were finally forced to retreat when a British force flanked them. During one of the charges, Arnold's horse was shot. And I need to say, I would not have wanted to be one of Arnold's horses. He was always having horses shot under him. I mean, when you're brave and you're on a horse, that horse doesn't have a very long lifespan. And in this case, the horse fell and it trapped his leg under it. A young local Tory dashed up to him, bayonet fixed, shouting, "Surrender, you're my prisoner." And with a mighty effort, Arnold freed himself, saying, "Not yet," and drawing his pistol, he shot the man in the chest. He then leapt over a fence and ran through a swamp with bullets spraying all around him. And then the following day, sent off a message to one of the generals to waylay the regulars from the front while he and his men attacked them from the rear. But the British learned of the ambush and they were able to get away. After this rallying of these troops and trying to protect Connecticut, Congress relented and they gave Arnold his promotion to be a major general. But They did not restore his seniority, but at least they decided to give him that promotion. So this was now 1777, and later that year is the very decisive battle at Saratoga, and I'd like to read you a bit about that battle. And that was one of the major achievements of Arnold. When he talked about how we would all be grateful for some of the things he's done, this is the major one. When he was at Saratoga, Washington had sent him because he felt that the militia would follow him. He had that tremendous charisma that men would follow him right into the face of death. It takes a tremendous amount of both self-confidence and a spirit of being able to rally people in order to do that. The officer who was in charge of the army at Saratoga was General Gates, who had liked Arnold when he built the little fleet on Lake Champlain. But Arnold was a protege of Washington's, and Gates was someone who really wanted to replace Washington. So he was kind of jealous of Arnold, and had in fact been confined to his tent during the battle by General Gates and left without any command while the ground was shaking from the pounding of the great guns. After being confined to his tent, and I'll go a little bit into why that happened, he could tolerate no more, and mounting his powerful dark horse, he dashed toward the battlefield, shouting to his aides, "No man shall keep me in my tent today. If I am without command, I will fight in the ranks. But the soldiers, God bless them, will follow my lead. Come on, victory or death." And I galloped straight into the thickest of the fighting, pursued by Major John Armstrong, who General Gates had ordered to bring him back. But Arnold was faster, and catching up with the rear of Learned's brigade, he asked the men who their officer was. A soldier shouted, "Colonel Latimer's, sir." Arnold was delighted. "My old Norwich and New London friends. God bless you, I'm glad to see you. Now come on, boys, if the day is long enough, we'll have them all in hell by night." And the cheer went up as he put themselves at their head, galloping back and forth on his splendid horse, brandishing his sword over his head. What amazes me, having taught military history, is the idea that someone without any official command could get out on that battlefield and the men would follow him. And they did. The reason that he had no command was, as I say, that General Gates was not fond of him. He was jealous of him. He wanted him to go back, to basically leave the army there. But the men had petitioned, and the officers petitioned, that they wanted Arnold to stay. So even without a command, he had stayed. I should say, too, that the person who did not leave his tent that day was General Horatio Gates. Gates, his tent was in a place where he could not even see the battlefield. Not only could he not see it, he spent the whole day in his tent, and one of his men who came to tell him what was going on found Gates was spending his time arguing with a wounded British officer about the merits of the revolution. And he was very disgruntled that he could not convince this officer that the revolution was a good idea. So here's Arnold out there fighting, and there's Gates in his tent, arguing with a wounded enemy. At any rate, at the head of Glover's and Patterson's brigades, Arnold led an assault on the British works being held by light infantry. A first attack was beaten back, but a second with bayonets fixed drove the British light infantry from their brigade. Leading Brooks's regiment, Arnold attacked the breastworks, and suddenly he was aware of what's called the Sally Port, where the British lines opened up for anybody who needed to retreat, and he led his men right at it. He could see that there was a weakness in that line, and that was where they needed to go. I'll give you does not want to. There we have the map of Saratoga, and you can see the different men. These are different officers, the Morgan's line and Learned's and Poor. They were all American officers. And there's Gates at the back there, his headquarters, you can see in the southern part of the map. And then Arnold going toward that redoubt. Okay. So he attacked the redoubt and at this sally point. The Germans facing them fled, firing a final volley as they went. One bullet hit Arnold's great dark horse, killing him, and the animal fell, pinning Arnold. Now a musket ball hit Arnold, shattering his leg just above the bone. It was a leg that had been hurt a year before when he was in a battle to take Quebec, but it had healed, and now it was really just shattered. One of the men, John Redmond, an American private who saw Arnold fall, rushed to bayonet the German soldier who'd shot him. But Arnold shouted to Redmond from the ground where he lay helpless and in excruciating pain, "Don't hurt him. He did but his duty. He's a fine fellow." Then he shouted to his men, "Rush on, my brave boys." And they did, streaming over the British redoubt. And this is the attack that basically turned the battle and won the battle. But when Arnold was hit, one of his fellow officers asked him where he was hurt when he went down, and he said, "In my leg. I wish it had been my heart." Later on, he was carried from the field bleeding and helpless. He waved away the officers who hurried to help him. When Captain Dearborn asked where he was hit, as I say, he said he wished it had been his heart. Armstrong, who Gates had sent to catch him and bring him back, now caught up with him. Of course, he was hurt. He wasn't going to go anywhere. But he was unwilling to go back to headquarters. The men of Asa Bray's Connecticut Militia Company, caring for one of their own, gently placed Arnold on a litter and carried him to the field hospital. Gates never set foot on the field during the battle that day, nor did Lincoln II in command. But Horatio Gates was given the honor of having won that great battle, and Congress had minted a special coin, and there's a wonderful painting of the surrender, with Gates accepting the surrender from the British. This was a great turning point in the Revolution, and because of that great victory, the French, who had been sort of quietly helping us, decided to come out openly and support the Americans, and it was basically because of them that we won. Once the French got into the war, the British realized that they were going to have to pull back a bit in America because they had colonies and interests all over the world where the French would be competing against them. So this was really a tremendous help. Arnold, of course, spent something like 3 months in a military hospital in Albany in terrible pain. The doctors wanted to amputate his leg, and he would not allow them to do that. Now, the amputation would probably have made sense because he might have gotten gangrene. And I think he probably didn't want to because he did not want to live a cripple, really. He would prefer, this is just my thought on it, to prefer to have died. I actually have a picture of him falling during that battle. After 3 months, he was okay. He survived, but he was having to learn to walk again. He was really, really badly maimed from that, and it was never completely healed. And I should say on that note that years later, when he was in exile in Britain, he had several sons who joined the British Army, a couple of whom fought in India. And one of those sons was shot in the leg and refused to have the doctors amputate it, and he died of gangrene. So Arnold was just, I think, not willing to put up with that. Because he was now wounded, he could not take the field, and he was sent to Philadelphia by Washington. The British had evacuated Philadelphia, leaving a terrible mess. The Pennsylvania government had fled from Philadelphia when the British came, and now all of these people would have to come back to their city. And Arnold was to be the commander to ensure order and stability as they came back. This is where he meets Peggy Shippen, this lovely woman. Let's see if I have her. This is Arnold at Philadelphia. Here's Peggy. She was known as the most beautiful woman in Philadelphia. And I know people now don't think, we look at that picture and think, she doesn't look that spectacular. But well, I don't know whether the portrait doesn't do her justice, but all of Washington's officers were in love with her. She was lovely. She was 18. Her family were neutral. Her father had been a judge working on one of the admiralty courts for the British, and then when the war broke out, obviously he left that and tried to remain neutral. The stories about her being involved with Andre in an affair are not true. I hate to tell those of you who've enjoyed watching that story on television. But actually, she was wooed by Arnold and married him. The government in Pennsylvania was led by a committee, a council of, I think, 7 people, and they were very radical. They had fled when the British took over. They came back. They had a long list, over 3 of names of people that they wanted Arnold to arrest right away as people who were possibly loyalists or certainly were suspect.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
332 people, and also some people that they wanted to convict with a bill of attainder, which is just basically voting in the legislature that somebody was guilty. Arnold refused to arrest all these people. And one of the other founders of our republic, James Wilson, actually defended a lot of those who'd been accused of treason by this council. But they didn't like Arnold at all. He was too moderate for them. They resented him. And after he'd been there a couple months, they had drawn up a whole list of charges against him that they felt that he was misusing his position. He used public wagons. He paid for them, but they didn't like the idea that he used them and actually crossed over from Pennsylvania to New Jersey with those. So they drew up these charges, printed them in their local paper, sent copies to every other state, and insisted that the Congress court-martial Arnold. I should say we sometimes forget that the Continental Congress was in Philadelphia, so the government of Pennsylvania really did have the Congress, right there in their backyard, and it was a little hard, I think, for them sometimes to deal with these people. They said that Arnold was oppressive to the faithful subjects of this state, unworthy of his rank and station, highly discouraging to those who've manifested their attachment to the liberties and interests of America, disrespectful to the supreme executive authority, that is themselves. There was also, and I hadn't realized this until I started studying this issue, a lot of division within the Patriot side. So there were people who were more moderate, there were people who were more radical. And the radical Pennsylvania Council had gotten the militia charged up. And at one point, the more moderate people in Philadelphia, including Wilson and Morrison and some others, were actually barricaded in their house against this radical militia, which surrounded the house and attacked it, bringing rods and crashing on the door, and there was shooting occurred, fighting broke out, and 6 or 7 men were killed. This is among the Patriots on both, within the Patriot side, and others badly wounded. And Arnold rushed when he heard the fighting, but by the time he got there, the council had appeared, and they simply arrested everybody. When he was charged by the council with all of these infringements, the Congress decided that Washington had better have some kind of a court-martial. And Arnold wanted it because he thought it would help clear his name. There were court-martials all the time. I was just amazed. I mean, most of the people who sat on Arnold's court-martial had themselves been court-martialed. But at any rate, 2 of the charges he was convicted of, one on the wagons. And in fact, the Pennsylvania Council had threatened that there would be no wagons for the Continental Army unless they got Arnold on this particular point. And they had Washington write him a letter censoring him. And it's around this time that he decides to approach the British. One of the other things that happened to him, and then I'll conclude, is that Even though he resigned as commander in Philadelphia, he was attacked in the street by thugs who claimed that he was in favor of the Loyalists, had to draw his guns to protect himself. He asked the Congress if they could provide a guard for him, and they said, well, we can't do that, but ask the Pennsylvania government. Of course, the Pennsylvania government were the people who really disliked him. So it just sort of felt like there was no way to get around these people. They also felt that he had not been careful enough with the money that they had given him for his military campaigns, and that he owed the Congress something like £1,000. I should say, I'm running out of time, but I should say Congress didn't pay him for years, but they insisted that he owed them £1,000. So he was just kind of besieged by all these things and had, decided to approach the British. I don't have time really to go into his treason. He had planned to allow the British to take West Point, where he had become commander of West Point. This was found out. The British intelligence officer, John Andre, who had made arrangements to talk with Arnold about the plans, was caught on his way back to British lines, where the plans were stuck in his boot. And you can sort of see this being taken out. He was cornered by 3 men who basically were probably bandits waiting for rich people to come by. But when they had him take off his boots, they realized he was a spy probably, and they took him to the nearest military headquarters, where he ended up being tried as a spy because he was not wearing his uniform. He was a very, very gallant man, and even though he was the spy master, everybody thought he was wonderful. He ended up being hanged, and on the way to the gallows, the people who captured him wept as he went. He was a very sympathetic person. I should say, too, that the British never forgave Washington for having done that. And then some years later, Andre's bones were dug up and carted off to Britain, where they're buried in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner, of all places. At any rate, Arnold, eventually, when the British left, went with them. Peggy, his wife, was at West Point with him when this plot got discovered. She'd only been there a couple of weeks. She was there with her 6-month-old baby. I don't believe she knew anything about what he was about to do. It's unlikely he would have told her. She was given a choice of going into exile with Arnold in New York, or going home to her family in Philadelphia. And she decided to go home to her family. And I'm sure that if she was guilty, she would never have done that. That was extraordinarily dangerous to do. They were quite keen to hang people in Philadelphia for treason. She wanted to stay with her family, but the council in Philadelphia did not want anyone who was connected with Arnold getting information of any sort back and forth. And so they insisted that she go into exile. And her father took her, she was his favorite child, took her up to New York to go into exile. And I don't think he ever saw her again. When the war was over, she and Arnold were evacuated to London, and that's where they stayed the rest of their lives. Their only monument to Arnold is this boot that was erected actually by someone who served an officer in the Civil War. It's on the battlefield at Saratoga. It's of a leg, Arnold's leg, that was shattered during the Battle of Saratoga. There's no name on it, but on the back it says, "In memory of the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army, who was desperately wounded on this spot, the sally point of Burgoyne's great Western Redoubt, October 1777, winning for his countrymen the decisive battle of the American Revolution, and for himself the rank of Major General." He obviously made a terrible decision in siding with the British, and all of the things that he had done before to support the cause and secure American freedom have been just lost in the memory of this terrible treason. There's a stained glass window that this is a picture of that was erected by a resident of New Jersey not long ago, and in the London church where Arnold and his wife Peggy and their daughter are buried. And it very tactfully says, you can see the British flags and the American flags, and it very diplomatically says on it, the two nations whom he served in turn in the years of their enmity have united in this memorial as a token of their enduring friendship. Thank you very much.
We're ready for questions. Where's Kelly? Anyway, question here, Bill.
You told us that Arnold was very brave. He was a very
Right.
brave person for the U.S., but yet he was a traitor. And he went over and lived in Britain for so long. Why didn't we go after him? Why didn't the U.S. go after him and dispose of him? Why did we allow that?
Well, we did try. I think that Washington had a price on his head before the British left. Arnold was in New York, and he led a couple of British campaigns, one in Virginia, actually, and one in Connecticut. And there was a price on his head and people who were after him, but they were never able to capture him. Washington was unwilling to release Andre in exchange for Arnold, which is what the British officer Clinton would have done. And there's some sense that the British were really quite annoyed in a sense. I mean, they got Arnold, he escaped and went to them, but Andre, who they cared about a lot more, was captured, and that maybe Arnold would have been willing to be traded, but the British were unwilling to do that. And then, of course, once the British left and went to back home, there wasn't any chance of that. So Arnold lived the rest of his life in Britain. And he volunteered to serve in the British Army later, but they didn't accept him. And he came home to Peggy and he said, "They will not let me die a soldier's death." But that's a good question about...
Other questions? Yep, we have one here.
Were you surprised with what you found out about Benedict Arnold when you did the research?
I really was. I was surprised at the amazing ability of the man. He had never had any special military training, and yet he was just a brilliant officer and leader and had that kind of charisma that made people want to follow him. But I think he also was one who would not tolerate fools, and so he had a string of enemies. The other thing I found surprising was this division within the Patriot side of people who were more radical and people who were more moderate. They actually had a shootout in Philadelphia. That amazed me. I had no notion of that.
In plain view, Americans are being assigned British royalty positions. In lieu of that, isn't it hypocritical for America to keep calling Benedict Arnold a traitor?
Well, I thought it was very diplomatic on that stained glass window to say that he served each country in turn. It's strange that we think of the people who rebelled against Britain as the Patriots, but basically they were all traitors to Britain. And I guess it was Franklin who said, if we don't hang together, we shall all be hanged separately. I mean, it was really dangerous to have taken on Britain. So I think that he was a traitor to the side that won. I mean, if Britain had won the war, or if we'd negotiated, which is what a lot of people had hoped, he might have been considered a hero. He chose wrong. He had spent all this time and sacrificed his fortune and his health and everything. All his property was taken. He could never go home. It was really sad. I mean, I called the book The Tragedy of Benedict Arnold because I think it really is a tragedy.
When he decided to go to the British, did he do so because he thought the British were going to win the war at that point in time?
I think that might have been part of it. I think that basically he was just kind of disgusted with the way he'd been treated. And at the end of it, they still insisted that he owed them £1,000, which he did not have the money to pay. His father had been a bankrupt and a debtor, which was terrible. He felt that he wasn't being respected. And it meant a great deal to him, reputation and honor. And honor was one of the most, key things for gentlemen of that time period, and in some ways still terribly important. So I think he felt dishonored about that. And the British were saying, look, they actually sent a commission, the Carlisle Commission, promising the Americans everything they had first asked for, except independence, and saying, we'll give you all of this. If you keep fighting, you might not win anyway. And at the end of the day, you'll have all of these things, and you'll spare yourself more bloodshed. And that makes some kind of sense, that people will stop fighting. Most of the people who started the war thought it would end very quickly, and it didn't. And they got quite distraught, and very few people wanted to serve in the military, and Congress wasn't paying them. There was a lot of reason to be dispirited. And it would have saved lives if they had had some kind of an agreement. So, thinking about it, the Monday morning quarterbacks long later afterwards, it made some kind of sense, but it was a real shock, and particularly since he'd been such a hero, it was a terrible shock.
So you've touched on this. I was wondering what you think of the portrayal of Benedict Arnold in the series Turn.
I have to confess I haven't watched it because I'm a historian and I get quite upset by things that are historically inaccurate. But I have heard, and I know that whole story about Peggy is not true. And of course, I gather that she's supposedly partly responsible for his treason. I mean, the things they say about him don't make sense, that if you were self-serving and greedy, why would you risk your life time and again for the cause? So there had to be more to it, but I guess I should watch that, and then I can speak more learnedly of it.
Thank you so much for your comments. I was wondering if you could address Benedict Arnold's relationship with Freemasonry. As he was a Mason here, George Washington was made a Mason here in 1752 in Fredericksburg. Right. And I know I've been a Mason almost 40 years, and we talk about him in our lodges as well as some of the guys overseas. Yeah, and they're not supposed to even mention his name in a Masonic lodge. And I wonder how Arnold would have reconciled his decision, and what, if you could tell me a little bit about his Masonic history and how it related to his decision to do what he did. That's a very interesting question, because he set up his business in New Haven, and that was one of the earlier places in Connecticut that had a Masonic lodge, and it was very prestigious to be a part of it. And he was nominated to be a Mason, so that he was a very respectable member of the community, and I was impressed by the fact that he was a sort of young man with a family background that was clouded by his father's having been a drunkard and a debtor, and yet he had done so much to build up his family that they made him a Mason. So I thought that was really surprising. But I don't know more about the Masons than more internationally than that. But I thought that meant that people regarded him as a very respectable, enterprising young man.
How did he make a living after he left for England?
he got a pension from the Crown, and Peggy got a pension from the Crown. He also tried, he had 3 sons in Connecticut. His wife died in 1776. And so Peggy was his second wife, and then he had more children with her. And he was constantly trying to provide for his children. So he went to Canada several times and set up a business there for his sons, which wasn't too successful. But he spent a lot of time trying to make ends meet, and particularly to do something for his children. And I think that that's why so many of his sons ended up in the military. I mean, that was a sort of respectable and kind of a family business at that point. But he had a lot of trouble worrying and ended up living in kind of humble circumstances.
Kelly.
You tell how in New Haven in the early years, one of his sailors was going to turn him in for smuggling, and they did the vigilante thing. How common was that, and how was that accepted by the community to just go and run the guy out of town and beat him up and all?
Yeah, very knowledgeable. That I think that most of the Americans were quite happy to live with the smugglers. The goods were cheaper. John Hancock was a famous smuggler. Juries that tried smugglers, American juries almost always found them innocent. And in fact, that was why the British began to try Americans for smuggling in London, because they did not want to try them before American juries. There was no way you were going to convict anybody. So I think that there was sort of a general connivance with this kind of thing. So I don't think that people minded too much. I mean, they resented this guy telling about the smuggling.
Kelly.
You mentioned that after he went back to England, he then joined the British Army and invasions in Connecticut and Virginia, which of course is true. My question is, was this part of the West Point deal, that when he turns over West Point, he would go to Britain and become a British officer against the Americans, or did it just turn out that way?
Actually, those 2 campaigns were out while the British were still in control in New York. And he had wanted to serve as an officer in the British Army. So that was, I guess, part of a deal, as it were. The British were very cagey about what they were going to do for him. He wasn't a field officer very much for a while because of his serious injury. And they kept saying, no, don't worry, we'll take care of you, we'll take care of you. But he knew that as soon as he went to the British, he was going to lose all his property, everything that, his property in Pennsylvania and in Connecticut. And so he really needed to have some kind of a position, and he wanted a military position. So it was part of the arrangement. And then he was on had these 2 short campaigns, one in Connecticut and one here in Virginia, and one of which sent Jefferson actually fleeing from this area.
Other questions? Last chance. All right, now, wait, one more.
Perhaps there's a lesson in the motivations that superior commanders have. Have you noticed that the plot of the Iliad follows the story of Benedict Arnold so closely, and at the center of which is a woman?
Yes, Helen. No, I hadn't noticed that, but that's interesting. Yeah, I don't think a woman was so central to this one, actually, although it makes it sort of exciting to think that. But Peggy was actually very faithful, and she stayed with him when in exile, but not very happy. She came back to the U.S. once, after years later, to see her friends and family in Philadelphia. But it was very sad because most people didn't want to have anything to do with her, and so she just went back to London.
Well, on that classical note, and before we say Thank you again to Professor Malcolm. Let me tell you what's coming up Thursday of this week. Doug, if you'll put it up there, we'll take a look. And it is a look at Jane Goodall by her primary biographer, Dale Peterson. It's this Thursday, so I hope you will be here for that. And with that, we will say thank you to Professor Malcolm.
For being such a wonderful audience and great questions, too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.